good afternoon, and good evening, depending on what part of the world you're in. This is Alissa Knight filming on location in London, England, on my way to the Cybertech conference in Tel Aviv, Israel next week. Please help me in welcoming the executive leadership team from Salt Security, who's attempting to make this world a better place by helping organizations secure their APIs. So without further ado, please welcome Salt Security. Why don't we go left to right, since we have so many people here in the party? Chris, why don't you introduce yourself?
Awesome. So I'm Chris Whestphal. I head up product marketing, actually all things marketing here at Salt Security. And my background, I come from, worked at a couple of security companies before this doing microsegmentation, working in the CASB space, worked for a large virtualization company and a pretty big infrastructure, data center, networking company in my past. And yeah, that's where I come from.
Awesome, Chris. Thanks for being on the show. Roy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm Roy. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Salt Security. My background came from deep tech and security background. Started programming before I was able to read almost, and joined elite cybersecurity units when I was 18, leading cybersecurity project development and products for the military, the Israeli Defense Forces, from a defensive and offensive perspective. And after that, did a couple of roles as part of cybersecurity companies, did a lot of projects for the government and the military, and really seeing how APIs are really driving the innovation in the world, but at the same time being not secured at all. So that's actually what led me to found the company.
Awesome, Roy. I knew you were going to say IDF. Every Israeli because like they were a member of some sort of elite IDF unit, top secret, covert action, spookiness. Some problem.
We are seeing the problem. Yeah, this is how it starts. You start in the military grade, you go so deep, and then you start to see the problems ahead of time. And then slowly it's going to go to the enterprise phase, and then the medium business phase, and the small companies. And
sure.
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of great innovation coming out of Tel Aviv right now. I was when I was at the RSA conference last year, they had this big Israeli startup pavilion thingy, and there were just a bunch of Israeli startups in that Israeli startup pavilion, and there's just a lot of venture capital, a lot of stuff just coming out of and being poured into Tel Aviv. It's amazing. Mm-hmm. So
yeah, definitely. It was reported that it's the second after Silicon Valley. It's the second biggest scene or startup scene after Silicon Valley, even bigger than New York. So it's really impressive.
Awesome. Well, thank you for being here. We're really excited to learn about Salt and what you guys are doing over there. You guys are this best kept secret in API security. So hopefully we'll help change that. Adam, we saved the best for last.
Thank you very much. So Adam Fisher, I got my start in security back during the WinNuke 95 days, if you roll back the clock that far. And ever since then, I've just really been interested in security. I started off in lots of different roles with different technologies. Over the last 8 years, I've been focused on application security specifically, and have a strong background in WAFs and Swagger files and all that. And having joined Salt before Salt, I was at Imperva and had a lot of background there. So it's been a great ride here. A very exciting time to be in APIs, and that's why I joined here. Basically, seeing the difficulties that WAF vendors have in protecting specific API endpoints. When it's not just your normal traditional web application, now you're dealing with mobile apps and you're dealing with API endpoints. It completely changes the attack landscape, and any traditional WAF struggles with that, and that's exactly why Salt's here.
So basically, I'll be Pinky and you're the brain, and cool. That's awesome. Well, it sounds like we've got some really smart people on the call right now. I'm looking forward to nerding out on API security. Why don't we? I don't know who wants to take this question. I love that we have so many people here, by the way. I just think it makes for a more interesting show. What do you guys think is the reason behind all these API breaches? What's I mean, we're continuously, we heard about Panera Bread, obviously T-Mobile, you've got the Marriott breach, I believe was an API breach. What's going on out there? What is happening? Why does it seem like we've now gone 20 years back in cybersecurity with APIs? Because we're seeing things like lack of authentication and authorization. What's happening out there?
Actually, I'll jump in quickly and say, Adam and I are working on a blog post, and this has been used in security for years. But the Willie Sutton story of, why do you rob banks? That's where the money is. I think it's a couple of things that we're seeing. Number one, that's where the money is, so to speak. That's where the credentials are. That's where the information that I can monetize an attacker is. That's where I can get to things like bank account where I can do fraudulent transactions. So I think that's one thing. The other thing is that it is a bit of the Wild West now. We've spent years of creating these great perimeters around data centers and cloud environments and layers and layers of security. And to me, APIs have just blown a huge hole in these in these fortresses that we've built. And if you think about an API, it's exposing logic and valuable data, and it's just how can you resist as an attacker? And so I think that's something that we're seeing is that trend of attackers understanding this.
So what you're saying is it's the fact that it's a juicier target. That there's data behind it. It's just a stickier, it's a bigger honeypot, so to speak. And it's all about monetizing that data and APIs being really the gateway to that data. It's about the data. I mean, it's what they say, data is worth more than oil these days, right?
Yeah. I think, by the way, that...
Sorry,
go ahead, Adam.
Go ahead, Roy.
No, I was about to add on top of Chris. For me, it's also, data, right? The price is like one thing, and it's one of the biggest things, right? You have more and more sensitive data being exposed, and the trend is being more and more open, right? Open banking, companies being a SaaS company. So everything the trend is to open data. The other combination, I think, is the fact that you have more APIs. If you see the graphs of API growth, you see like exponential growth in APIs. Because everything is getting connected, everything becoming more open. So you have more attack surface. And I think the third thing is the fact that APIs are changing quite frequently and have more functionality, right? The trend is, instead of having this major release every 6 months or every year, now you have a trend of CI/CD pushing changes to production. Developers more own things, want to continuously to innovate. So basically the APIs keep changing, and every change is a potential vulnerability, right?
Do you think this was really pushed from the app economy, right? So like a lot of people obviously are saying, it's because of the move to microservices and monolithic applications, dying, and we're moving away from monoliths. Or do you think it really kind of started before that with Apple creating this massive app economy in the App Store and a lot of these other things that are communicating over APIs? Do you think this all started with mobile apps? I mean, is that what we're looking at here? Or did this, or do you think that, obviously the move to microservices has really fueled this growth of APIs, but what if it came before that? Do you think it's like carriage, cart before the horse, right?
No, I think absolutely, like mobile apps push this growth significantly, because if you think about it, one of the reasons you moved from HTML, render HTML pages for the traditional web applications to APIs is that you had different clients, right? And you want to have a standard way to interface with the company data. So now you have a mobile app, and it's not rendered in HTML, so you need different formats, right? So an API would work for a mobile app, and then it says why we have a different app for web application, why we cannot use the same data. It will be up to date. So it will be more the same interface for getting all of this data. So you move to single page application, right? With React, Angular, JS, and so on. And now we have more and more devices getting connected. So definitely, I think mobile apps introduced another client that require a more standard way, like an API to retrieve data or to update data and so on.
Yeah, go ahead, Adam. I think you wanted to add something.
Well, yeah, the way I look at it is, eBay released really one of the first web APIs out there. And if you look back to those eBay days when you have 30 or 60 seconds left on your bid, and you're refreshing that ticker every second, that API was just going to pull that exact data that it needed. It wasn't going to pull back the entire web page. And so APIs allow that speed. It allows just the data that you're requesting to be fed back. You're not requesting the entire web page again, and so it's a lot faster. Nowadays people want those real-time sports scores updates and things on your Gamecast, on your ESPN sites and things, and that's what it allows it to do. And so definitely we're seeing that proliferation because we want our data even faster, and we don't want to have to wait for everything to reload.
You might be able to answer this question. One of the things that I'm noticing is, in just I've been working in security for about 20 years. Yes, I am that old. I'm a lot older than I look. I started on the BBS scene, if you can remember the BBS days. One of the things that I'm noticing is that vulnerabilities kind of repeat themselves over history, right? Over the last 20 years, if you remember the Woo FTPD days, a lot of things are really just kind of rearing their ugly face again in vulnerabilities. And it's almost like the vulnerabilities that we're seeing in APIs is like so shocking, like hard coding API keys and tokens in mobile apps. Like, what are you talking about? Like, this is 2020, right? Like, I don't know if you saw that research that I published where I downloaded those 30 financial services mobile apps and hacked all 30 banks. And because of those hard-coded credentials, hard-coded S3 bucket keys, all these things. And what's happening? Do you think it's just humans? Like, what is it? If you don't learn from history, history repeats itself? Like, I don't know, Roy, are you a developer? Do you know why? Or Adam, do you guys... Or Chris, do you know why that's like? Why do we keep seeing this same thing where you think that we've been spanked so many times that we would have learned by now?
So at least my take is that I think developers are focused and driven. They have a different focus, they have different goals, and it's not security. Some of them are more security conscious, but still. They have specific goals, right? They have the sprint. They need to complete specific tasks. Everything is agile. Need to push. Everything is becoming more and more. I wouldn't say aggressive, but company want to grow fast. They push changes faster. It's not like major releases, as I said. And if you are focused on the functionality part, you're not thinking about security. Most of it doesn't have the knowledge, right?
Yeah,
what's the fastest way that's gonna work, not gonna break, and right, then I can move. And I think that's where the problem starts, right? You don't have the expertise, you don't have the focus. And that's why, even in Israel, for example, you see many developers coming out of the security units, have a lot of security backgrounds, but, you see them at specific companies, developing a SaaS app, and they'll know, like, I need to get it to work. That's number one priority. And then I have other things that I need to get it done. And I'm not going to spend like 3 days to reviewing the security aspect and think like an attacker, how potentially I can manipulate it. Although I have some of the knowledge, but I don't have the time for it. So,
and it's funny because I reached out to some of the developers at some of the banks and I asked them about some of my findings. So one of the developers I ran into clearly showed his experience level because he didn't know that. I explained to him that there's a subdirectory called all private keys where I found all of these decoded, pre-computed private keys. And his first question is, how did you get access to that subdirectory? I'm like, what do you mean? You didn't know you can pull an Android app off of an Android device and actually, have you heard of MobSF? Have you heard of, these? And so, I think it's probably a combination of a lack of experience with these developers. Much to your point, Roy, I spoke to an experienced developer as well. And he said, hey, I have to put these tokens on the app. I have to put them somewhere. What do you want me to do with them? I have to put them there. So it's like those things of, in-app protection, code obfuscation, stuff like that. That's just, they know it's sort of functionality first, security second. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely agree. And I think, but on the positive side, I think we do see huge progress on other vectors. I think, like 7 years ago, 8 years ago, 10 years ago, even, you saw like most of the breaches were like SQL injection and XSS, those,
Right.
everything. And then like the WAF, web application firewall space, kind of started to emerge somewhere in the early 2000s. But today you can barely see, if I recall, it's very, I think, hard to spot in the last 2 years, even one breach from SQL injection.
That's
and
true.
because you don't see it anymore not because, by the way, we, necessarily developers did a better work, because the tools that we use to develop APIs, the frameworks, now have better built-in security against those type of injections. The database providers doing a better job providing SDKs or ORMs, the libraries that helps to interact and query the database in a way that will not allow you to do certain injections. And also, plus the bonus that we have no SQL databases or different ways, to save data. So all that together, we are seeing it across all of our customers that, we used to see like many years ago in my security background, a lot of SQL injection vulnerabilities like all the time. And now you see like number one, the broken object level authorization is across customers. So
right.
We did do a lot of progress on the known attack vectors, but I think now as the logic getting more exposed, and it's not just an HTML page with all the data, but you don't know how it's being queried internally. Now everything is being exposed and says, this is how we do our business logic, which allows attacker to be more sophisticated about, maybe the developer didn't think if I'll do that, right? And try to tweak it in a way to, like you said, right, transfer money from another account because they don't anticipate somebody
loading up Postman and not using the mobile app,
exactly,
or something like
exactly,
that. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. What about you, Adam? You were going to chime in there as well.
Well, just, definitely, the market on the API side, kind of how this thing works, right, is first companies start to use it, and then we have to secure it. And so we're definitely in the stage now where it's proliferating on the business side. The business is seeing the advantages, and now we're left to pick up the pieces. And so that's what we're doing.
It's very much, I'm trying to be as much of a proponent as I can of shift left security and trying to put that security in the development life cycle and try and move that left versus right. But Salt Security obviously focuses on the right? So why don't we talk about that for a minute? So if one of you wants to go into who Salt Security is, what technology you guys have brought to market to help organizations secure their API attack surface. I mean, and the average number of APIs an organization runs is around 620 APIs. How do you find all of them? How do you know about them when they go live? How do you secure them? So I'm assuming that's what Salt Security is here to do and address.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Roy, do you want to go ahead?
No, go ahead, Chris. I'll answer that.
So we're Salt Security. We, our whole goal, here's a marketing line. We want to make it safe for our customers to innovate, right? And innovation, we see a lot of innovation coming through these applications that are all API driven. So we want to make it easy for developers to focus on the things that they're good at doing, which is innovation, iteration, moving fast, building new features and functionality. And in our solution, we have three main capabilities. The first one is what we call discovery. And the whole idea here is that, a lot of customers, especially bigger organizations, aren't aware of all the APIs that are running in their environment, right? There's the shadow APIs that a developer stood up because they needed to get something done. There's the older versions of APIs that never got deprecated. They're all, it's just a whole mesh of APIs, and people know that they don't know what they don't know, right? And that keeps, I think, a lot of CISOs up at night. So we solved that problem initially, and this is something that's ongoing, right? With our model, we're ingesting API traffic. We're looking at real-time traffic, and everything that we do is based on this ingestion of looking at real API traffic. And that first thing is building that comprehensive, always up-to-date API catalog. So I know what my attack surface is. I know what I'm up against. The other thing that we do in the context of discovery is we show customers where they're exposing sensitive data, PII, for example. And with this information, I can have a better conversation with compliance. I can also better align my security approach to, where that sensitive data is. I can have a better conversation with my development team if maybe I'm overexposing sensitive data. So, so that allows me to wrap my arms around the problem with step one. Step two, which is really the core of our solution, we call prevention. And we actually have a granted patent around this with the ability to detect and prevent API attacks. And again, through the ingestion of real-time API traffic, we're able to look at the various activity. We initially create a baseline of normal activity for an API. And we have granular understanding all the way down to the endpoint level of the API activity. And then we look for deviations in that activity that tell us that something malicious might be going on. And the important thing is that we're not looking at and reporting on every single deviation, because me putting a phone number in an email address field could be a deviation. But from a security standpoint, that's not at all interesting. More so what we're doing is we're collecting all these anomalies and we're building a profile for an attacker, so that we understand, during reconnaissance, what they have done over a period of time, all the things that they've tried, all the places they've tried to poke and prod and find vulnerabilities so that they can exfiltrate data or take over an account. And we can provide that insight to a security operations team, so they're better positioned to react to that particular attacker. And, we're doing this correlation of activity and doing correlation even as the attacker is trying to obfuscate their activity, moving to different devices, moving to different API sessions, all these things. So that's the prevention piece, identifying the malicious activity, building that profile for the attacker, and ultimately stopping them. And then the third piece it really helps to bridge the gap between security and the developers. This is our shift left, so to speak. But we take everything that we learned from the attacker during reconnaissance. We say that we turn the attackers into penetration testers. So all that poking and prodding, everything that they've tried to do to figure out where the vulnerabilities are, we can now enable security to provide that insight to the development team, through a Jira ticket or through some other ticketing system, or even by sneaker netting it over. And so the development team knows exactly where in the API a vulnerability exists, exactly how an attacker tried to manipulate it, and how the application responded, so that they have a prioritized list of vulnerabilities that they can now go and eliminate. So really three steps. Yeah, you have the discovery, which allows you to understand your attack surface, the prevention, which looks for anomalies, builds that profile for the attacker and blocks the attackers. And then that last piece, which closes the gap of providing the developers the insight to actually go eliminate the vulnerabilities in the APIs themselves. And that's what Salt Security is up to.
Yeah. And I'll just add, Chris, and I think like one of the biggest thing that we'll bring, of course, in order to be this next generation solution that actually solve this problem, this new attack vector, is leveraging really the technologies of big data and AI that wasn't available before. And we look at the API security problem, it's impossible to detect the top attacks for API without understanding the uniqueness of every API. Every company, this Zoom meeting that we are using right now, every bank, every app has its own unique logic. And if you don't have the deep understanding of every unique logic in a very granular details, it's impossible to detect those attacks and vulnerabilities. And that's something only be possible to achieve with big data. When you have a lot of data about the API usage, you are able to see the big picture and then to determine what's really normal and to pinpoint attackers. And where you see more other vector or, other categories like WAFs and other products fails, is they're adopted like the common traditional reverse proxy architecture, where you try to basically, put everything on one server that in real time will try to inspect on the fly an API call and determine if it's malicious or not. Where in reality, you need much more data than a single server. It's impossible to do that in a single server. So we took like completely different, more innovative architecture to solve this new problem.
Interesting. So you guys, if I were to summarize your solution, you really focus heavily on the identification of API assets. So which APIs exist out there, which APIs are possibly transmitting and processing PII. To even, and I'm assuming you're a network-based solution versus an endpoint. So very much like a network intrusion prevention system, but for APIs. So you address the shadow IT problem of APIs, of an organization not knowing what they have, to securing what they do know they have, what's been cataloged by your solution, and then preventing those attacks based on the API traffic you're seeing and any deviations from that known good behavior, which I'm assuming is being powered by machine learning, either supervised or unsupervised learning models.
Yes. So yes, it's unsupervised models. We have actually both supervised and unsupervised, depends on what purpose. But yes,
Okay.
our granted patent, it's for identifying and preventing API attacks using machine learning. And finally, we have the remediation that not only we are blocking attackers, we actually, as Chris said, we are making attackers be used as penetration testers or bug bounty hunters, essentially, to, yes, they're probing the API where the API failed to respond correctly, right? Somebody tweaked the API, probed the API, but the API didn't reject it or crashed, return a stack trace. So because we know what's normal for every permutation of every API call, we can say to the relevant group, hey, in this mobile API, in this specific URL, in this specific parameter, you didn't check, A, B, and C. Here's some proof points.
Oh, wow.
So we make it very simple for them to also harden their API over time and not only block, do this game of blocking and somebody come from another account. You can actually solve the problem. And I'll tell just to mention, I think another thing regarding prevention and why we think it's very critical to have this big data architecture in order to solve it, is because in APIs, it's no longer only one transaction or one API call to exploit something. Like you had in the old days, the SQL injection, which is still relevant, but as you can see in the top 10, it went down to a number, I think 7 or 8.
I think it's 8 at the end, 7 or 8, right? Yeah. Exactly,
because it's not common anymore. And the reason, because it's not only one-time transaction. It's not like a single transaction. You need to look at various parameters over time, different calls, in order to know this is something that is critical. And for that, you need to track things over time. In order to track things over time on millions of users, again, you need a lot of storage. You need the specific type of databases. You need specific algorithm to run in scale with Spark and so on. And again, it's force you to go to this big data architecture, because otherwise what will happen is what you see in most, for example, WAFs, or I wouldn't say even API gateways, because they're more on the authentication side. It's like a single, snapshot of, I think this API call is not okay, right? It has some code from this AP, and you basically get a table. But today, as API scale and you have enormous amount of volumes, it's impossible to investigate anything like that. So that's why we are kind of correlating all of the events and give more advanced analysis of saying, you have an attacker, he's coming from thousands of IPs, maybe he switched some devices, but he has the same user ID because we can track it across different requests, and this is the name of the user, and give you, like, the customer a clear view of one alert for all the attempts for a single user, and give them a nice timeline explaining exactly what happens to allow them to respond quickly.
Interesting. So now, your guys' solution, I think I recall, it's actually, unlike other solutions, it's not inline, so you guys don't become a single point of failure for the API servers. You guys are actually hanging off passively, either from a tap or a span port. So one of the things I wanted to ask you is, so is your solution deployed as like a hardware pizza box, a 1U pizza box, or do you guys ship as Docker containers, or how do you guys ship the product?
Yes. So the way we deploy, we have various types of sensors to collect the traffic passively, as you said. It's going to be through a tap, a span port, container, Kubernetes, native integration, API gateways integrations, sensor on the Linux level. We are really flexible to any environment, and we can have multiple options. Yes, we are not in line, but because, going back to what I said earlier, because we are able to track the source of the attacks, it allows us to integrate back to the already existing inline components that every customer has, right? Every customer has firewalls. They have CDNs, or they have API gateways. They have components already that, given that you give them the information of block specific IP, specific ID, based on a specific header, they will do it. So we leverage the existing inline components to do so. we could have easily been inline as well, but we think for the customer, just an easier approach, right? It doesn't, as you said, we are not a single point of failure. We have no latency. We cannot cause any damage to the environment. But on the flip side, we're actually leveraging his existing investments to make them smarter and to do the blocking.
Understood. So, sorry, go ahead, Adam.
Yeah, and I think that's important because we're looking at the request, and we're also investigating and analyzing the response that we get.
The stimulus and the response, so you can actually correlate the two together. So you guys have an understanding of sessions. You guys manage sessions.
Yeah, and so if we were inline, that'd be a lot of additional latency. WAFs already add latency when they inspect the request, and if a WAF had to or attempted to inspect the response, that would really almost damage the application. And so by the architecture that we have here, we alleviate that roadblock, that headache that the end user would feel as they're waiting for that data to come back. But at the same time, like you said, we correlate that session. We have the request and the response tied together to get that complete picture.
One of the things that I find really intriguing about cybersecurity vendors today with big data and software as a service is you guys have the ability to what I like to call crowdsource threat intelligence, right, from your deployment. So Salt clearly has deployments out there. Are you guys using any sort of new IOCs or indicators of compromise that you guys have never seen before, that's just totally crazy, totally off the wall, that you've never seen, and pulling that in to make your guys' product smarter and better? So as you guys see new sort of attacks out there in the wild against API servers, do you bring that in and improve your product with it?
All the time. I think all the time, since we are a big data and a cloud solution, so we have this be able to oversee all the customers' data trends attacks, and adds more what's called more behavioral features to our models in order to properly train them. That will be a better indicators of very early on of reconnaissance activity. So when attacker only start to probe the API, right, is in 2-3% to his progress, even finding a vulnerability, start to probe a little bit, we are already detecting this process. So we're detecting them very, very early, and we continue to add more behavioral features to that based on these behavioral features, we are able to detect those attackers early on, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. So, and my next question, putting my marketing hat on, Chris, you have a huge job ahead of you. Huge responsibility, and I'm going to get his name wrong. Nia, is it Nia?
Yeah.
Your new marketing guru.
Yeah.
So you guys have a huge job on your shoulders. You're really trying to educate the market on the difference between API gateways, API security gateways, the need for them, and why a CISO just doesn't come to you and say, hey, Chris, guys, why do I need your product when I've got a WAF? Apogee or whomever saying that they can, fill in the blank here, that they can secure my APIs, and it's the same solution that I'm using to manage my APIs. Apparently, it's kind of like the whole TV VCR combo. I can also use it to secure it. If you guys remember TV VCR combos, I'm probably the oldest one on this call. No, so, and then now you have the cloud service providers like Microsoft with Microsoft Azure and AWS saying, hey, you know what, guys, we're going to eliminate all the third parties altogether, and we're going to just start providing these security solutions for you as a service. You've got AWS's API gateway. What's happening here? Like, what do you guys tell buyers when they're saying, why do I need you when I've got a WAF? I've got all these other options. Why do I need an API security solution?
So I think that you're right. I think there's a lot of confusion. There are a lot of solutions out there. I always think of a CISO going to RSA where there's like 500 to 600 vendors. Thinking, who do you talk to? How do you decide where to spend your money? So definitely a tough job, even on the security team, trying to figure out how you're going to protect your environment. There's no silver bullet. I think a lot of these vendors aren't doing any service to the customers by confusing the issues. I think more and more people are kind of piling on the API security bandwagon with their perspective. You've got the gateway vendors with authentication authorization. You have the WAF vendors trying to stay relevant and kind of evolve their story with next-gen WAF. To me, one of the big things, short of just doing our own evangelism and working with folks like you and other people in the analyst community, one of the big things for us is the Owasp API Security Top 10, which is a great key for a lot of customers to look at. Okay, how should I approach this? It's not something that was vendor built. It's something that's been vetted by the community, by security practitioners, by people who build and understand what it takes to secure APIs and applications. And it really lays out the requirements for how you should be thinking about and approaching and really acquiring a solution to protect your API. Some of those are covered by maybe what an API gateway can do or what a WAF can do. They can attack some of those requirements, but comprehensively, looking at it comprehensively and understanding what it takes from the ground up to really protect your API and your applications, I think is super important. And that's something we talk to customers about a lot. We give them examples on what they should be looking for and the types of threats and how our solution helps to address that.
Yeah, and just to add my perspective here as an adversary or as a red teamer, I can tell you that I don't think, and I've seen this play out in my attack labs, security shouldn't be a feature of a product. It's like if you think about these API gateway companies out there, these API management companies, and I'm not trying to knock them. We need them. We need API management solutions, of course, but I've never been a believer that security should be a feature of a product. It should be the product. You don't build, it should be built from the ground up as a security solution, hardened operating system, lest the security solution become the pivot point for an adversary. And, I've been involved in numerous penetration tests where I was able to get a foothold on the API servers, even though they had an API gateway in front of it. It's because a lot of these solutions are not purpose-built as security products. They're not purpose-built as security solutions. It's, it's that whole thing, well, I have OAuth, so why do I even need security? I've got OAuth, and not really understanding. And I think, and the reason why I have an enormous amount of respect for you is because you do have a huge job at it, because it's really educating the market. It's an education, that needs to happen with buyers that, hey, look, you're using this to manage your APIs. You can't expect it to do both jobs, lest it become that TV VCR combo and your VCR breaks and all you have is a TV. So
what are you gonna watch then?
Yeah, exactly. And I've had that happen to me where the VCR just stopped working. All I had was a freaking TV. So anyway, we won't go there. But Adam, do you and Roy have anything you want to add to that, or?
Yeah, so definitely from, my background come from the WAF space. I quickly saw that as APIs became more, more in use, that, the WAF had a difficult time, matching that. It's like Roy said, we do the, the big data analytics, we do the logic. We're basically, profiling the API.
Right.
And that's the type of protection that's needed. You can't just send a vulnerability scan against an API and expect the same results you would get from a web application.
An IIS server. Yeah. Well, it's funny because if you take actual real world attacks into play here, right? What are we all talking about here? Let's point the pink elephant out in the room. What we're talking about here is context. It's the fact that we in 2020 need to start applying context to security, right? So WAF is just looking for things like SQL injection or, a // or trying to break out of a directory on an IIS server. It's not looking for things like, legitimate API post and GET requests being sent from Postman versus being sent from the mobile app. If you look at the bank compromise that I just did, I was sending the API post with Postman, and they look legitimate. So the WAF wasn't doing anything to stop it because they look legitimate. There's no SQL injection. There's no traditional web application attacks there. There's no cross-site scripting. There's no cross-site request forgery. There's no SQL injection. It's just a legitimate looking API, but the context is just because Alissa is presenting this key doesn't necessarily mean she should be seeing this data. And it's when you have solutions like yours that are profiling API and say, that's weird. We've never seen this IP. We've never seen this user. We've never seen this sort of traffic requesting this kind of data before. Why is she doing a select on all of these rows in the table or whatever it may be? And she's got the key, she's got valid credentials, but does that necessarily mean that she should be seeing this? It's applying context to security. And I think that's where solutions like Salt excel.
And that's an important part there, because not only are we looking at what you would be sending, but we are investigating and correlating what you are receiving, what the response is. And those two things is what goes into the profile. When you do profiling, it's not just, one piece of the puzzle. You got to have both sides to the equation. And that's a key part that oftentimes gets overlooked when you're just doing a WAF and you're just looking at the request traffic.
Yeah.
And I think to add to that, Adam, it's even in a layer that it's not a single request and response, right? You're looking at the entire events coming from the same user over can be weeks or days, right, of somebody doing specific actions. So first of all, it's the understanding to know who is Alissa in this mobile app, what represents Alissa, right? Is it this user ID? And then I know to track specific entity. Maybe it's changing something, so I need to have a better identifier. So, and then to understand what are the action. If maybe you got one time 401 response code from a specific API endpoint, it's okay, it's legitimate. Maybe your token expired or something. But if you have a lot of those in an endpoint that normally doesn't respond with 401 for other users, right? Because you track other users, and it's happening all the time in a short period of time. So suddenly you have different context, as you said, right? Because you understand what is a user, you understand the unique behavior of every API endpoint, which respond differently, and you have the overall look on all of the users to know if it's one of a kind or it's something that completely changing the API. So you have better understanding. And I think going back to your kind of questions or comment on API gateway, I look at API gateway, in my one of my analogies is saying, you have your company as a building, right? And an API, open API is like opening a door, right? I don't expect somebody that sells me the door or you're install the door to have the sophisticated alarming system in the building that, checks that nobody, or in the bank, right? Nobody is crossing specific sections or have more advanced security systems. The door will give you the lock, right? That's the API gateway. It will give you a token. If you have the token, you can go inside. It doesn't check more than that. You are legitimate. I can go inside. It doesn't check if you are attempted to get access to somebody else's data or, numerous of other accounts or users' data. It's pretty simple. So if it helps them to build an API, that's good, but we'll be the layer that is more advanced than that. Then they do this behavioral profiling to know who is accessing, who is passing this door, what he's trying to do, what he's trying to access, what he did a day before. Did he try to smash a window a day before and now him try to access another door is completely not legitimate? So you have this broader context. So for me, that's the play of the role of API gateways. And I think WAF is, it was really relevant with traditional web apps, where you can do everything in one context, one request response, and look at the HTML page and look for cookie poisoning and other things like the other attacks that we mentioned. But as we move to APIs, it's becoming less and less relevant, and that's why you see also in the market kind of solution merge in a way, right? You see a CDN that do WAF component or bot, because there's not a lot of meat around the APIs anymore, and you need to, and that's why you see more API security vendors like us kind of start to emerge and lead in this market.
Do you think the confusion was created by the fact that CISOs historically were sort of conditioned to protect things that spoke HTTP protocol or HTTP with a WAF, and now that they said, oh, wait a minute, okay, well, I have these API servers, they speak HTTP. I should use our WAF to secure it because it's talking the same protocol. Do you think a lot of that confusion was being
absolutely
bred from that?
Yeah. I think it's like change between, behind the scenes, the same app moved from being a monolith or being traditional web apps to, some components driven by APIs, but it's exposed to the same infrastructure in a way. It's the same protocol, as you said, and it's creating a lot of confusion. Definitely, I think if it was completely different protocol that WAF wouldn't support, and then you need a completely different product, it requires you to proactively think about what you need to have. But I must tell you that in the last year, we can say that companies growing out of this phase of thinking their WAF cover it and actually thinking about API security as a project. And we're seeing a lot of projects dedicated for API security without them even mentioning or thinking that a WAF would be able to solve this problem. So we see this maturity, start to happen in the market.
Yeah, one of the things I like to provide our audiences is an explanation on what pre-sales questions they should be asking their vendors. So can any of you help the CISOs who are listening today or watching, what are the pre-sales questions they should be asking their API security vendors? Because, you've got obviously you guys have competitors out there. What should they, if they're looking at Salt Security, what should they be asking your salespeople about the technology when they're evaluating different solutions? What are the sort of questions they should have have answered by the vendors on their technology when they're shopping for something like this?
So I think number one, first of all, do they have granular discovery capabilities? Because that's the first problem, right? You need to know what you need to protect. So are they able to discover APIs in a granular detail, know where your sensitive data, to profile of your API, document all of your API automatically without this manual configuration? Because it's critical. Where you have human configuration, you have human errors, and it just doesn't work anymore in our scale. So I think that's number one, dig deeper about the discovery capabilities. I think number two is to understand their posture against the top 10 for Owasp API security. And I'm emphasizing here API security top 10, not the Owasp top 10. And not just, do they cover it? Yes, actually understand it. What are those examples? The Owasp actually give very practical examples so you can actually test it out. So I think that's number two. And thirdly, I think one of the indicators is to understand the architecture better, right? How you are able, what's your architecture? Are you a proxy? Are you have multiple servers? So given this architecture, how you are able to correlate events or in this specific attack over time, if you have only, you're on-prem and you have a single server, how is it possible you track every users that I have, right? So dig deeper around the architecture because it tells you a lot about the limitation a product can have. And if it's more on-prem and you can deploy with 2 servers, so I would be a little bit concerned that it will be limited to what you can do on 2 servers.
Awesome.
Chris.
Adam, did you want to add anything, or Chris?
Another common thing we see is the confusion with a need to have some type of a Swagger definition file created. So, from that perspective, you really want to, you don't want to have to do any extra work to onboard an API or to add an API to the solution. So just piggybacking what Roy said on the discovery piece, being able to do that continuous and automated without the need for your dev team to provide the solution with information. And that's
Got it.
What we see a lot today.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You don't want to add any additional, you don't want to add anything to your developers, put anything additional on their plate, besides just trying to get the code written and focus on what they need to focus on versus having to go to them and say, hey, we need you to kind of pause what you're working on to be able to create
give us your API code or something.
Yeah, exactly, for the security solution. Yeah. And not that developers and security engineers are the best of friends in the first place anyway. Let's leave that one alone. Chris,
and I think last thing,
Roy, go ahead.
I'm sorry, just so at one point, I'm sure Chris will add to that. It has to be scalable across your environment. So
it's not
only for containers or only for Kubernetes or only for JSON based, right? You need to have, if you acknowledge that you have a need and a problem, how you solve it across the enterprise. You have cloud, you have non-cloud, you have XML based, you have JSON based, and in later this year you're gonna have containerized application in Kubernetes. So you need to have the same solution for your existing stack, but looking a little bit far down the road and make sure that the solution that you buy right now is going to fit with and scale across your environment.
Good point. Chris, anything from the marketing side?
Well, I was maybe not from the marketing side, but you want to think about how you're going to deploy this thing, how it's going to integrate with your application, if it's going to be disruptive, if it requires code changes, configuration, care and feeding. Do you need an expert to actually make this thing work effectively? And do you have to update it ongoing? And then the last thing is, how do you bridge that gap between security and developers? I mean, you mentioned that they're not the best of friends, but obviously they need to work closer and closer together, especially as security becomes everybody's problem. And how do you close the gap and do something like remediation, or how do you identify and prioritize those vulnerabilities that you found so that they don't become a problem in the future? So I think those are other things to kind of think of as you're evaluating solutions.
Amazing. Well, I could nerd out with you guys all night long about this because this is my my domain. I love API, talking about API security. How can anyone who's interested in Salt Security find you guys and contact you about getting a quote and or POC? How can you show? I'm assuming you guys are on Twitter, LinkedIn. You've got obviously salt.security is your domain.
Yeah. Those are the big ones. I mean, the big ones are our website, salt.security. There's no .com, .org, .io, anything after that. So that's the hardest part. Is
I would have been
resisting
really impressed if you guys got salt.com. Roy, did you try making a bid for that domain?
We looked at it for sure.
I can't imagine it's cheap. Oh,
no, it wasn't cheap. So, come check us out on our website. Visit us on LinkedIn, Twitter. I think if you send us an email to contact@salt.security, respond to that as well. But you can sign up for a demo on our website, and we'd love to dig in and show anybody more.
Awesome. Well, I'm drunk on the salt Kool-Aid, so I really appreciate you guys over there. You got some really smart people on that end, and I look forward to working with you guys in 2020. So thanks for being on the show today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
All right. Thanks.